Escape is a 1994 action thriller loosely based off The Penal Colony, an 80s sci-fi novel written by Richard Hurley. It stars Ray Liotta as Captain J.T. Robbins, a soldier sent to an island prison for murdering his commanding officer.
You marched directly up to your commanding officer, put a gun to his head, and blew his brains out.
Things go down between he and the warden, which forces him to get dumped onto Absalom, an area where the worst inmates are free to wreak havoc on one another. At best, it's an inoffensive little movie with an interesting, albeit overdone, premise. Still, it's well acted and directed with a decent score. It's one of those perfect lazy day hangover flicks that got a lot of airtime on Sunday afternoons in the 90s. I'm sure some people legitimately dig it. Ray Liotta, Lance Hendrickson, and Ernie Hudson are great in pretty much anything. It was also directed by Martin Campbell, who would go on to do GoldenEye a year later and Casino Royale, which is still one of my top 3 Bond flicks. The futuristic setting of 2022 would be more laughable now if it weren't the year of Ray Liotta's death, and I can't believe it. There's another Dylan. Double Dylan. I've been revisiting a lot of Liotta flicks lately, and this one definitely isn't one of the worst. Hey, did you know he voiced Tommy Vercetti in Vice City? Don't believe me? Well, just have yourself a look at the comments of any interview with the actor posted on YouTube. After he died, anything to do with him on this crap forum is littered with repetitive, uncreative remarks about how he was in that game. Have we seriously become this lazy? It's like we are our own spam bots, repeating the same things in different ways, identical statements vomited out, stealing images and videos posted on social media to pass off as our own.
There's just something that you do that after seeing it like over and over and over again, I was wondering if you've ever thought about yourself doing this over and over and over again.
No Escape, the movie. There's probably a few reasons it has fallen into obscurity. It also probably didn't help matters much that it was retitled Escape from Absalom in certain regions. Still, I'd recommend it for the well-captured action sequences and above-average acting alone. It's a fun romp that deserves a bit more credit, much like the video game that accompanied it. Yeah, I bet you're surprised to hear me say that, huh? This thing was torn apart by critics upon release, and there isn't even an FAQ available online. Only one complete playthrough exists of the inferior Super Nintendo version, and the few who have reviewed it didn't seem to even give the game a chance. I don't necessarily blame people for getting turned off. It doesn't start out well, and some of the more ambitious bits are too cryptic, but it feels like a product made with at least a semblance of heart. It's clear Bits Corporation were inspired by games like Pitfall, Prince of Persia, and Flashback, which is good. Conceptually, a 2D puzzle platformer suits the source material, but there's a lack of polish here that's impossible to ignore. I'm only speculating, but 6 months isn't a whole lot of time to finish a game. Even if the developers were given a head start, I'm sure backing was all but pulled when the film flopped. This is one of those rare licensed carts that isn't easy to find, and my guess is that this is a direct result of how poorly the property did in theaters. A Sega CD port was silently canned, which only further proves my theory. I mean, hell, the Bram Stoker's Dracula game was spread across more consoles the year before, and that thing is a filthy mess of trash. The only difference is that Francis Ford Coppola's take on The Count was a cinematic success. Speaking of that shitty Dracula game, we have Sony ImageSoft involved here yet again, a company I eventually learned to avoid like the plague in the early to mid 90s due to their mostly horrible track record. Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Cliffhanger, Last Action Hero. People frequently ridicule LJN for their movie tie-in trash titles, but no one ever talks about ImageSoft, an equally low-level publisher who seemed only interested in the bottom line. Bits developed No Escape, but this embarrassing distributor pushed it out the door. A pre-PlayStation Psygnosis assisted more with the 16-bit Sega version. Psygnosis and Sony before the latter's first disc-based console hit the market. Bedfellows a few years before they would team up on a lot of those early PlayStation games. Stay away from the majority of ImageSoft's 16-bit titles. If you want to play a Dracula game outside the realm of Castlevania, you play Nosferatu, which itself is a bit like this thing. No Escape opens with a shockingly well-produced cinematic, though the artwork doesn't do much for me. Personally, I find the human characters rather garish, but there's a sense of style with enough planning in this production to prove someone cared. After this, the player is immediately, jarringly dropped into an opening stage set in the jungle with a never-ending squad of enemies in hot pursuit. At least that's how the Genesis version begins, as the Super Nintendo alternative needs a few embarrassing seconds to load, making it an even more unpleasant introductory stage for SNES owners. Both games are nearly identical when it comes to enemy placement and stage design. The biggest discernible difference to the naked eye is that the Nintendo version is a bit stretched, a common issue among titles shared between the two consoles. It's why I generally prefer 16-bit Sega games. They just feel snappier. In this case, the Genesis version definitely plays quicker. This makes the Super Nintendo a touch easier as its controllable coke-bloat protagonist has more time to react, that is, in most situations. The spike traps in this one are covered during the intro stage, making them infinitely more challenging to avoid than the exposed ones on the Genesis. A map screen follows this initial gauntlet, allowing the player to tackle the game however they see fit. Almost every area is free to explore, except for an underground region that requires a light source. For all intents and purposes, this entire stage is optional, with a variety of interactive secrets that result in different narrative outcomes. No Escape has multiple endings, and it's extremely rewarding piecing the clues together to achieve them. The central point on the map is the village, where the characters from the film congregate to trade items and offer some hints. It's also where your hut exists to dump goods found in the other regions. There's a limit to what Robbins can hold on his person, which is fine, but the swapping of materials is more confusing than it should be. This is the game's biggest problem. So, there are tidy little care packages strewn across all of the action stages. It's possible to backtrack across these areas if need be, but if you diligently dump all of your newest pickups in between map points, you won't need to revisit them. The bits and bobs accumulated are necessary to complete the game. Crafting items is a big deal, and swapping goods with fellow prisoners is crucial. What sucks is that there are so many pieces of scrap to be found, and they need to be in your inventory to experiment with while you're actively in an action stage. It's a better idea on paper. I appreciate how clever all of this is, but it could have been handled so much better. Everything that revolves around this system is cumbersome, made worse on the Super Nintendo due to how slow the menus respond. The idea is to collect, swap, and equip items to assemble into gear. Weapons, explosives, and gadgets can be built. Few pieces are easy enough to parse with a bit of logic. Arrows, bolts, grenades, and lamps contain self-explanatory scraps, but others can be downright confusing to create. The gear required to escape the island is a pain in the ass to swap, build, and materialize. It feels like the game goes out of its way to make trading as user-unfriendly as possible. The Super Nintendo version also boots the player out to the map screen instead of the village when exiting huts, which is a small complaint made bigger due to how slowly everything rolls. Look, this isn't a very long adventure, and I'm cynical, so I think the developers over-designed the hell out of this crafting feature to pad out the length. There are only 4 areas to explore, with a few sub-stages each at most. It's an experience that offers up a bit of replayability due to the hidden areas and multiple endings, but there's not a lot to really explore. Hints and clues are available, but I definitely felt like the pertinent information was being withheld for the sole reason of keeping me in the dark. It's not Simon's Quest amounts of nonsense, but it's honestly not that far off, and No Escape was only released in North America, so translation problems can't be used as an excuse. For instance, one hidden area houses a destructible wall that looks just like the others. I could understand if this was a common theme throughout, but it's the only unmarked exit I know of, and resources are extremely limited. Another obstacle requires an explosive to open up a tree fort passageway. This one's a bit more forgiving, as there are no clear levers to pull and the exit text is within eyesight. It's a lot more clear that something suspicious is going on here. The icon in the top right corner lights up with a little symbol when an environment can be interacted with, but figuring out what needs to be done isn't always clear. If you don't have the proper gadget or items to assemble one on hand, backtracking is necessary, and this upsets the flow. Each stage contains its own variety of villains and objectives to deal with, which I like a lot. One entire area is an enemy camp with insta-death electrical traps that need to be disarmed by slapping around carefully placed generators. It's one of the more action-focused regions with every possible nook and cranny packed with hazards, which wouldn't be so bad if it were easier to make out the dangers. The muddy graphics often make it tricky to discern where traps lie. Another has the player vertically make their way up the exterior of a Big Bad's hotel base, while explosive traps rain down from above. The last explorable set piece takes place high above the ground in a treetop region fit for an Ewok village. This is probably the most complex of the map points available from the start, with tons of densely packed lever traps and enemy ambushes. Rounding out the lot, we have two fully developed levels hidden away behind item locks. A few boss battles pop up as well, but there's really nothing to them. Combat is pretty weak. Robbins has quite a few moves at his disposal. He can kick both high and low, as well as punch to defend himself. Rolling, jumping, squatting, grabbing the sides of platforms, running. It controls similarly to other games of this ilk, so there's a bit of input hesitation due to the exaggerated animations. Advertisements boasted that the characters were rotoscoped, which is fine and all, but everything's so sloppy to look at, especially on the Super Nintendo, where our main man is extra jagged. The Genesis alternative is a lot more washed out, which kinda serves the mucky artwork better. Everything looks a little nicer in the dark. The backgrounds in this Sega version are mostly repugnant. They lack detail and look to have been painted by an amateur nitwit, smearing his bodily fluids on a canvas with a dish sponge. Enemies erratically spaz out all over the place and require next to no tact to eliminate. It's one of those get in close and slap the baddie around deals where trading hits is inevitable unless you're right up inside their bodies. This strategy also works for the majority of the bosses unless they're assisted by minions. In those situations, it all devolves into a slap fight.
No more fighting. I've been under a lot of stress lately.
A lot of times, projectiles fly at Robbins from off-screen in every direction, forcing the player to move carefully until they've familiarized themselves with the environments. On the plus side, the enemies are sensibly placed for the most part. There are quite a few cheap encounters, but I have definitely experienced worse. At the very least, the baddies and traps are always in the same locations, so things are manageable with a bit of memorization. At times, the platforming can feel rather finicky. Grabbing ropes, vines, and pipes can be frustrating until you've gotten a feel for how they work. You'll almost need to hold up on the D-pad after you've come into contact with them, which feels clunky at best. Creeping around in a squatting position also takes a while to get used to, as projectiles will still hit you while moving, making it necessary to stop every time something gets hurled your way. The stiffness of Robin's movements could definitely turn some players off, but after half a dozen attempts at the game, I began to memorize where everything was, and it started feeling like I was stealthily hunting down my prey. Exploiting the traps and enemy AI became extremely rewarding, but having to remember where things are is never a good replacement for well-crafted, intuitive level design in my book. Hearts are plentiful but distributed poorly at times. Enemies rarely drop them, which is totally fine, but the ones systematically scattered throughout the levels are questionably placed. Like, sometimes there'll be one very close to the start of a stage, or a few in one little area, which makes little to no sense, since you'll rarely need so many to top up Robin's life bar. Robbins, of course, being the playable protagonist based off of Ray Liotta's character from the film, Liotta being the guy who voiced Tommy Vercetti in Vice City. Every positive point I make seems to come with a caveat. Hearts fill health but are poorly placed most of the time. Checkpoints are more than generous, but they often dump you in the midst of enemy projectiles, or worse, right on top of a baddie's head. With a bit more playtesting, this could have been a better game, which is why I have opted to call No Escape rushed rather than incompetently crafted. Hourglasses are also dropped by enemies and found throughout the areas to add a bit more time to the clock, but I've only had it drain out once. 1-ups pop out of the bodies of baddies as well, and their art continues to be used. 3 on the Super Nintendo, 4 on the Genesis. From what I could gather, Andy Taylor took a day off from Mayberry to work on the music here along with Shahid Ahmad, and it's pretty good, inspired at times even. The Super Nintendo soundtrack is a bit more lush, with discernible harmonies not muffled by the system's inherent reverb-soaked audio hardware. As expected, the alternative has some of that shrill Western-developed Sega stuff going on, but it's far more competently mixed than other North American scores. Neither of them are inherently bad in the music department, but I've gotta say, the tunes loop way too quickly, and there's only one piece per zone, so they get very repetitive almost immediately. None of these really stuck with me either, which is a shame, but I'll gladly opt to listen to what No Escape has to offer over the majority of other licensed video game soundtracks. If you want to play something featuring Ray Liotta with an excellent score, I'd like to recommend you all to Grand Theft Auto Vice City, where he voiced the main character. It's licensed music, and you can't see his face, but none of his features are represented in this game either, really. When it comes to Ray Liotta flicks, Goodfellas was definitely his magnum opus, but I'd like to recommend Narc, a grim film noir focused on 2 Detroit detectives. It's one I don't hear mentioned often, and interviewers rarely acknowledge its existence. The man allegedly didn't accept a big wage for acting in it either. He believed in Joe Callahan's skills as a young writer-director and delivered an excellent performance. There's some late 90s, early aughts dialogue tomdouchery going on at times, but not enough to spoil the gritty narrative. It's a great little film starring Liotta and Jason Patric that received a helping hand when it came to distribution by Tom Cruise. Give it a shot, tell me if you liked it, and or No Escape in the comments, and rest in peace, Tommy Vercetti. Did you know he was voiced by Ray Liotta? Next time on this channel, Narc, more Narc, so stay tuned.
What are you doing? No one goes out at night.
I don't take orders anymore.
And we're all cons here. We're all lifers. And just like in the joint, we got rules. You could have been an outsider. You're lucky I didn't kill you.